Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. Ancient Greece and ancient China. Two civilizations born thousands of miles apart, separated by mountains, deserts, and centuries of isolation. To one, the world ended at the rugged passes of the Hindu Kush. To the other, at the shimmering dunes beyond the Jade Gate. They knew nothing of each other, no common language, no shared gods, only silence between them. And yet, against all odds, their worlds collided. Not through trade or diplomacy, but through war. A war fought over horses so magnificent that they were said to bleed when they ran. The story begins over 2 millennia ago, in a world half covered by empire and half swallowed by the unknown. It was an age when ambition stretched as far as the horizon, when men like Alexander the Great looked east and saw destiny written in sand and stone. His armies marched beyond the limits of maps, through the burning plains of Persia and the icy passes of Bactria, until even the soldiers who followed him began to wonder if they were chasing immortality or madness. As Alexander advanced into Asia, he built cities wherever his shadow lingered, bastions of marble and Greek speech in alien lands. The farthest of these was Alexandria Ishate, Alexandria the furthest, founded in the fertile Fergana Valley of modern-day Tajikistan. To the Greeks, it was the edge of the world, a lonely outpost where the wind carried whispers from both east and west. Here, Greek veterans settled with their families, farmers replaced soldiers, and temples of Zeus stood beneath the mountains of Central Asia. Centuries passed. The empire of Alexander fractured, but the dream he left behind endured. In these forgotten cities, a new generation of Greeks, the Greco-Bactrians, ruled amid the ruins of empires, keeping alive the customs of a homeland they would never see again. They minted coins bearing Greek gods, traded with Persian merchants, and spoke of Homer under alien stars. To the far east, beyond deserts they could scarcely imagine, another empire was rising, one older, richer, and more enduring than any in the Mediterranean world. The Han dynasty of China had forged unity across a vast landscape, ruled by emperors who saw themselves as sons of heaven. Yet even heaven's sons were not free from fear. In the cold grasslands of the north rode the Xiongnu, nomads whose arrows struck like winter storms, whose horses devoured distance faster than Chinese legions could march. The emperor of Han looked upon his empire and saw a looming shadow. He needed allies, new weapons, and stronger horses, steeds worthy of the wars to come. He would soon find all three, not in his own lands, but in the forgotten Greek cities of the West. And so began one of the strangest encounters in history, when the children of Alexander met the sons of heaven. 2,300 years ago, the march of Alexander the Great reshaped the map of the known world. From the plains of Macedon to the edges of India, his armies carved a path of conquest through dust and legend. Wherever he went, cities rose in his name, stone testaments to a vision that refused to die with him. Among them stood a city far beyond what any Greek had ever imagined, Alexandria Ishate, the final heartbeat of Greece in the east. Founded around 329 BCE in the Fergana Valley where mountains kiss the desert, Alexandria Ishate was more than a colony. It was an act of defiance against geography itself. Here, Greek veterans took wives from local tribes, raised children who spoke 2 tongues, and painted frescoes of Olympus beneath Asian skies. They built theaters, gymnasia, and marketplaces filled with silk and spices unknown in Athens. The scent of wine mingled with that of unfamiliar flowers, and under moonlight, the sound of aulos flutes drifted across the steppe. In time, the city became a bridge between worlds, part Greek, part Central Asian, a hybrid civilization that glimmered like a mirage at the edge of empire. Yet the dream of Alexander could not last forever. After his death, his empire fractured into warring kingdoms, each ruled by one of his ambitious generals, the Diadochi. Among them, the Seleucid dynasty controlled the vast lands from Anatolia to Persia, but their hold on the distant east weakened with every generation. By 250 BCE, the Eastern Greeks, proud, isolated, and weary of distant rulers, declared independence. Thus was born the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, a realm of marble temples and war elephants, of philosophers and mercenaries, of kings who dreamed of both Greece and Asia. From their palaces in Bactra and Iconium, they looked north to Alexandria Ashate, their most remote frontier, the last outpost of Greek civilization before the endless steppes. For nearly a century, these Greco-Bactrians flourished in fragile splendor. They minted silver coins bearing the serene faces of their kings and the thunderbolts of Zeus, symbols of a world still echoing with Hellenic pride. But the winds of Central Asia never stayed still. From beyond the horizon came new peoples, Saka, Yuezhi, and other nomads drawn to the riches of settled lands. The Greeks had built cities of stone, but around them swirled a sea of riders who lived and died beneath the open sky. In this borderland between order and chaos, between marble and dust, destiny waited. It would take the arrival of another empire, far to the east beyond the deserts, to awaken Alexander's dream once more. This time not as conquest, but as connection. When Alexander's empire shattered after his death, his generals tore at its edges like wolves over a carcass. The east, so far from Macedon that even messages took months to travel, was left in silence, a silence soon filled by new kings with Greek names and foreign eyes. Out of this isolation, the Greco-Bactrian kingdom was born. It was an improbable world, marble colonnades rising from Central Asian dust, Greek coins minted beside Buddhist stupas, and cities that glowed like fragments of the Mediterranean lost among the steppes. Their capital, Iconium, perched on the Oxus River, was both a memory and an experiment. Philosophers read Aristotle in shaded courtyards, while merchants haggled over silk and lapis lazuli. Here, Greece met Asia not as conqueror and conquered, but as two civilizations trying to understand one another. The Greco-Bactrians sent ambassadors to India, learned the rhythms of Persian poetry, and trained elephants alongside phalanxes. They were children of Alexander's dream, but also its contradiction, a people torn between nostalgia and adaptation. At the empire's northern rim lay Alexandria Ashate, the lonely outpost now serving as the kingdom's northern fortress. Its walls still bore the marks of Macedonian engineers. Its streets still echoed with the sound of Greek syllables, though softened by centuries of local tongues. The people of Ashate were Greeks in name, but Central Asians in heart. Their faces tanned, their customs mingled, their gods no longer purely Olympian. A statue of Zeus might stand beside a local deity of the wind, each sharing the same incense, the same prayers. But such beauty is fragile. To the north and west roamed tribes who recognized no walls, no kings, the Saka, the Yuezhi, and others who drifted across the plains like the seasons. They watched the cities of the Greeks grow fat on trade and tribute, and they waited. The frontier was not a border, but a heartbeat, one that could stop at any time. The Greco-Bactrian kings ruled for barely a century, their power flickering like a torch in the wind. Internal revolts, nomadic invasions, and the endless weight of distance eroded their unity. By the 2nd century BCE, their world was fading, swallowed by the very steppe that had once feared them. Yet even as their kingdom crumbled, their legacy endured, in art, language, and legend. For far beyond their borders, another power was stirring. In the east, where dragons marked the imperial banners, the Han dynasty looked westward, its emperors dreaming of horses that ran like wind and bled like gods. Their path would lead them across deserts and into the ruins of Alexander's forgotten dream, and to a war no one could have imagined. While the Greek cities of the west were fading into memory, a new empire was blazing in the east. The Han dynasty stood at the height of its power, an empire of scholars, soldiers, and silk. From the fertile valleys of the Yellow River to the mountains of Sichuan, its banners rippled beneath heaven's mandate. Roads stitched its provinces together, palaces shimmered with lacquer and gold, and its armies moved like disciplined tides across the frontier. To its people, China was not a country, but the world itself, the Middle Kingdom, the heart around which all else revolved. Yet even the heart of the world had shadows. Beyond the northern borders, in the endless grasslands, thunder rolled from a sea of hooves. The Xiongnu, a confederation of steppe tribes, struck swiftly and vanished like ghosts. They raided frontier villages, carried off captives, and demanded tribute from emperors who ruled millions. No wall, not even the Great Wall, could hold them for long. To the Han, these nomads were a haunting echo of chaos, a reminder that civilization's borders were drawn in sand. In the imperial capital Chang'an, Emperor Wu of Han, ambitious, visionary, and ruthless, refused to accept this humiliation. He had already reformed his army, expanded trade, and declared that heaven's favor was not inherited but earned. Now he turned his gaze westward, searching for allies who could counter the Xiongnu's mastery of the horse. Reports spoke of distant lands where the steeds were larger, faster, and stronger, horses that seemed to drink the wind and bleed under strain, as if their very veins carried fire. But such rumors were whispers from beyond the deserts, lands unknown to China, where the maps ended and myth began. For Wu, the unknown was not a warning, but a challenge. If such horses exist, he declared, then under heaven they belong to the Emperor of Han. And so he summoned one man, a court official named Zhang Qian, known for his loyalty and courage. Qian was tasked with an impossible mission, to find the Yuezhi, a displaced nomadic people said to dwell beyond the western mountains, and to forge an alliance against the Xiongnu. No envoy had ever journeyed so far. Between China and the lands of the Yuezhi stretched thousands of kilometers of desert and hostile tribes. But Zhang Qian accepted the command without hesitation. He was to carry gifts of silk and gold, and more importantly, the emperor's faith, a faith that believed even the edge of the world could be crossed if one carried the will of heaven. Thus began one of the most extraordinary expeditions in ancient history. As Zhang Qian departed through the western gates of China, the banners of the Han flickered against the dawn, and the wind carried him toward a destiny no one could have foreseen, a meeting between East and West that would change history forever. From the crowded halls of the Han court stepped a man whose destiny would bind two civilizations that had never heard each other's names. Zhang Qian was no warrior nor noble general, but a diplomat of quiet resolve, a man of intellect, patience, and unwavering loyalty. The emperor's command was simple yet near impossible: journey west, find the Yuezhi, and forge an alliance to crush the Xiongnu once and for all. Few missions in history began with such faith and such futility. Before he departed, the courtiers whispered that no one had ever returned from the lands beyond the Jade Gate. Beyond that point, the world dissolved into myth, endless deserts, savage tribes, and kingdoms where even the gods spoke foreign tongues. Yet Zhang Qian accepted the task without hesitation. He was armed not with soldiers, but with gifts, silk that shimmered like liquid sunlight, gold crafted into imperial emblems, and scrolls bearing the emperor's decree. To the Han, he was a messenger of heaven. To the west, he would soon become legend. The caravan left Chang'an beneath a pale dawn, banners trailing in the wind as if waving farewell to the known world. They crossed the Gobi Desert, where the horizon itself seemed to burn. Sand swallowed their footprints. Silence followed their every step. Each night, Zhang Qian looked westward and wondered what waited beyond that shimmering void. To his men, the journey was madness, but to him, it was purpose. He believed that the world was larger than the empire's maps dared to show. Weeks turned to months. The food ran low, the horses thin. Then, before they could glimpse the mountains of the west, they were surrounded by riders, fast, precise, and merciless. The banners of the Xiongnu rose around them like dark wings. The envoy had not reached his destination. Instead, he had fallen into the hands of the very enemy he sought to destroy. Taken north into the cold grasslands, Zhang Qian's mission seemed over before it began. The Xiongnu treated him not as a prisoner, but as a curiosity, a man carrying the words of a foreign emperor. In time, they allowed him to live among them, even to marry a Xiongnu woman. Years slipped into a decade, and the world he once knew faded into the distance. But deep within him, a fire endured. The promise he had made to his emperor, and to himself. He would escape. He would find the Yuezhi. He would finish what he started. even if it took the rest of his life. In that frozen wasteland, far from Chang'an and civilization, Zhang Qian began to dream of freedom, of the lands beyond the horizon, and of the journey that would soon make him the first true bridge between East and West. The wind never stopped blowing across the grasslands. It howled over the plains like a restless spirit, carrying the cries of wolves and the crack of riders' whips. In this endless sea of grass, Zhang Qian lived as a captive for 10 long years, a man caught between two worlds. The Xiongnu did not cage him. They broke him slowly with kindness. He was given a tent, a wife, and a son. He learned their language, their rituals, the rhythm of life on horseback. Yet every sunrise reminded him of the world he had left behind. The great walls of Chang'an, the emperor's command still echoing in his mind. Each year he waited for an opening that never came. The Xiongnu watched him with suspicion, but also with fascination. To them, Zhang Qian was both guest and hostage, a living token of the empire they defied. In winter, he joined their hunts across frozen rivers, where spears glittered against the snow. In summer, he watched their camps sprawl like drifting constellations beneath the wide sky. He saw in them something both admirable and terrifying. Freedom unbound by walls or kings, power born of movement. Perhaps for the first time he understood why the Han feared them so deeply. But even admiration could not drown longing. 10 years of captivity had carved patience into his bones, but never resignation. He taught his son Chinese proverbs whispered by the fire, the words of Confucius and the songs of the Yellow River, fragments of a homeland his child would never see. He looked west at sunset, imagining mountains beyond the horizon, and wondered if heaven still remembered his name. Then one night, as autumn storms rolled over the plains, Zhang Qian made his choice. He and a handful of followers slipped from the camp, leaving behind the wife and son he could not save. The steppe swallowed them whole. They rode beneath moonlight, following stars instead of roads, guided by desperation more than direction. Days turned into weeks, through forests, deserts, and nameless passes where even the wind held its breath. When he finally escaped the lands of the Xiongnu, Zhang Qian was no longer the same man who had left Chang'an. His hair was streaked with gray. His eyes carried the weight of a decade's silence, but the mission still burned within him. He turned westward again, toward the lands no Chinese had ever reached, determined to find the Yuezhi, to fulfill his emperor's command, and to reclaim his destiny. The man who had once been a captive of the steppe was now a pilgrim of history, walking toward a place where East and West would meet for the first time. The lands beyond the steppe were like another planet. Mountains rose like walls of stone, rivers carved through canyons as deep as time, and the desert stretched between them, silent, merciless, unending. But Zhang Qian pressed onward. Each sunrise brought a new horizon, and with it the hope that somewhere beyond lay the Yuezhi, the nomads he had once been sent to find. The emperor's words, long buried beneath years of captivity, returned to him like a distant drumbeat. Find them, and bring them to our side. He crossed the Tarim Basin, where cities of mud and oasis kings clung to life among salt and dust. Some received him with curiosity, others with suspicion. The people he met were unlike any he had ever seen. Traders with pale eyes and foreign accents, men who carried both silk and swords, women who rode horses with the ease of soldiers. To them, the envoy from China was an oddity, a man from the Far East speaking of an emperor they could scarcely imagine. Through the Pamir Mountains, Zhang Qian and his few remaining followers marched among peaks lost in snow. Frost cracked their lips. The wind burned their skin raw. Many died, their bodies buried under drifts that would never melt. Yet still he advanced. Each step west was a defiance of fate, a statement that the known world was no longer enough. When he finally descended into the valleys of Bactria, the air grew warm again, perfumed with grapes and smoke from hearths. He had entered a new world. There he found the Yuezhi, once proud riders of the Chinese frontier, now exiles who had carved out a kingdom among foreign lands. But when Zhang Qian pleaded for their aid, they turned away. The Yuezhi had no desire for vengeance against the Xiongnu. They had found new wealth, new fields, and peace they would not trade for war. His 10 years in captivity, his years of wandering, all had led to this single, devastating refusal. Still, Zhang Qian did not falter. If he could not bring back an alliance, he would bring back knowledge. He recorded the names of rivers and mountains, the goods traded in every city, the customs of every tribe. He observed people with fair hair and tall stature, merchants who spoke of strange cities farther west, places called Irkin, Bactra, and beyond them, lands where even the sun seemed different. The world, he realized, was far vaster than the Han had ever imagined. He turned east at last, defeated but unbroken, carrying with him maps drawn in memory and stories written in endurance. Somewhere along the return route, his eyes caught sight of a distant city gleaming in the Fergana Valley. Walls of pale stone, vineyards rolling beneath them, and the sound of hooves echoing in the wind. It was there, among the people the Chinese would call Dayuan, that his journey would take its most fateful turn. It was in the lush valley of Fergana, where the desert finally gave way to rivers and vineyards, that Zhang Qian's long exile found meaning. Rising from the plains was a city unlike any he had ever seen, its streets paved in pale stone, its gates crowned with foreign statues, its people speaking a language of flowing consonants and rhythm. This was Irkin, known to the Chinese as Dayuan, the great Ionians. And for good reason. The men had deep-set eyes and dark beards, their faces sunburned and unfamiliar. They wore robes woven in Greek style, and in the evening they drank red wine beneath trellised vines. Zhang Qian walked through their markets in awe. He saw amphorae painted with scenes of forgotten gods, merchants trading grapes and olive oil for silk, and children reciting words that echoed faintly of the Hellenic tongue. These were the descendants of Alexander's soldiers, men who had once marched with phalanxes into the east and never returned. Now they called themselves the people of Dayuan, neither fully Greek nor fully Asian, but something new, born from centuries of distance. Their temples bore inscriptions of Zeus alongside local spirits. Their coins carried Greek letters next to foreign symbols. Civilization here was not imported, but transformed. The envoy recorded everything he saw. He noted their love for horses, creatures unlike any in China, with muscular bodies, arched necks, and coats that shimmered like bronze in the sun. The locals called them heavenly horses, claiming they could run for days without rest, their sweat tinged red as if touched by the divine. Whether myth or truth, Zhang Qian recognized in them the answer to his emperor's desire. To command such steeds would mean dominance over the steppes, a weapon of speed and prestige the Xiongnu could never match. Still, he observed something else beneath their prosperity: fear. The Greeks of Dayuan lived under the rule of northern nomads, paying tribute to stay safe. Their soldiers were few, their walls tall but weary. They fear battle, Zhang Qian wrote, and guard their wine more fiercely than their borders. The world that Alexander had built was fading into memory, but its echoes still lingered in every courtyard and every cup of wine. When Zhang Qian finally left Dayuan, the scent of grapes clung to his robes, and the sound of hooves haunted his dreams. He did not yet know that this fleeting encounter, between a Han diplomat and the forgotten heirs of Greece, would one day change the fate of continents. For the heavenly horses of Fergana would soon gallop into legend, and through them, the two great civilizations of East and West would finally collide. Among all that Zhang Qian saw in the strange sunlit valleys of Fergana, nothing captured his imagination more than the creatures the locals called the heavenly horses. They were unlike anything known in the Han Empire, their chests broad and powerful, their legs short yet unyielding, their necks proud as if carved from living marble. When they ran, dust spiraled around them like storm clouds, and when they stopped, blood seemed to trickle down their flanks with sweat, not from magic, but from small parasites that pierced their skin. Yet to those who witnessed them, they seemed touched by the divine. To Zhang Qian, weary from a lifetime of hardship, these horses were more than animals. They were symbols. In their endurance, he saw the power his emperor longed for, the speed and strength that could turn the tide against the Xiongnu. To the Han, who revered the horse as both weapon and omen, such creatures were heaven's gift. He noted every detail, their training, their feed, the price they fetched, knowing this knowledge would one day be worth armies. Each morning, the valley awoke to the sound of hooves. Riders trained beneath the rising sun, their cloaks whipping in the wind, their horses foaming white at the bit. The people of Dayuan treated these animals not as property, but as sacred, bred with care, guarded fiercely, celebrated in song. To own one was to hold a fragment of divine favor. Zhang Qian could almost hear his emperor's voice across the deserts. Bring them to me. He remained in Fergana for weeks, gathering stories of Alexander's settlers and their decline, listening to tales told by men who drank wine from clay cups and spoke of a hero king whose empire stretched to the sea. Their memories were fractured but proud, as if even in ruin they still carried the echo of Greece. When the envoy finally departed, he carried no horses, no alliances, only words, maps, and the glint of revelation. Years later, when Zhang Qian returned to China, those words would ignite an obsession. For among all he described, the tall foreigners, the strange cities, the rivers of the West, one detail burned brightest, the heavenly horses of Fergana. And when Emperor Wu of Han heard of them, his eyes gleamed with the hunger of conquest. What had begun as diplomacy would soon become destiny, a war born not of hatred or greed, but of admiration for a creature so beautiful that men were willing to die for it. When Zhang Qian finally turned his face eastward, the world he carried with him was no longer the one he had left behind. Years of dust and exile had hardened him, but his spirit burned with discovery. Across the deserts and mountains he retraced his path, through oases where his name was barely remembered, past ruins half buried by wind. What had begun as a mission of war had become something greater, a map of the world itself, drawn not in ink, but in endurance. His return to China in 125 BCE was nothing short of miraculous. Few men had ever left the empire and come back alive. The court at Chang'an received him as if he had risen from the dead. He bowed before Emperor Wu of Han, his robes still stained with the dust of foreign lands, and laid his findings before the throne. Scrolls filled with names that no Chinese had ever heard. Bactria, Fergana, Dayuan, Parthia. Worlds beyond the horizon suddenly had shape and distance, and the empire's imagination exploded outward. Zhang Qian told of fertile valleys where vines grew thick as forests, of kings who drank wine instead of tea, of markets where silk was prized like gold. He spoke of tall men with deep voices, of languages that sang like birds, of horses that ran until their veins bled red. Each word seemed to widen the room, as if the palace itself struggled to contain the immensity of his tale. For the first time, the Han realized that China was not alone beneath heaven, that beyond the mountains lay civilizations as ancient, as proud, as ambitious as their own. The emperor listened in silence, fingers tightening around the armrest of his throne. He had sent Zhang Qian to seek allies, and instead, the envoy had brought him a new world. There were no alliances to announce, no victories to boast of. Yet Emperor Wu saw what others did not, that knowledge itself was power. Through Zhang Qian, the Han now knew what lay beyond their borders, and what could be taken. That night, as the court celebrated his survival, Zhang Qian stood apart, watching lanterns flicker like distant stars. He had fulfilled his duty, though not as intended. His mission had failed in every practical sense, yet its consequences would reach across centuries. For among his many discoveries, one detail had already begun to haunt the emperor's mind: the legend of the heavenly horses. And from that single obsession, a war would be born. Years after Zhang Qian's return, Emperor Wu of Han could think of little else but the heavenly horses. Their power haunted his imagination, their speed, their endurance, their beauty. In those animals he saw not only the key to victory over the Qiongnu, but the symbol of heaven's favor itself. He would have them, no matter the cost. In 104 BCE, he sent envoys westward bearing gold, silk, and gifts of jade, an offer of trade and friendship to the people of Dayuan. The orders were clear: purchase as many of the divine horses as possible. Yet somewhere between the emperor's command and the city's stone gates, something went wrong. Perhaps the envoys spoke too proudly in the name of the Son of Heaven, demanding tribute instead of barter. Or perhaps they offered too little silver for too great a prize. Whatever the cause, the Greeks of Dayuan, proud descendants of Alexander's settlers, took offense. The envoys of Han were seized, humiliated, and killed. The horses, they declared, belonged to no foreign lord. It was a decision made in pride, born of ignorance, and one that would bring war to their very gates. When news of the slaughter reached Chang'an, silence fell over the imperial court. Then, the silence broke beneath the fury of the emperor. The message he sent west was simple: if heaven's horses cannot be bought, they will be taken. A decree was written, sealed with the dragon of the empire, and delivered to the generals of the frontier. From that moment, diplomacy was dead. The age of the envoy gave way to the age of the soldier. Emperor Wu appointed his kinsman, General Li Guangli, to lead the invasion. 20,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and endless supply wagons were assembled beneath banners of crimson silk. Their goal was not merely conquest, it was redemption for an insult that reached the very throne of heaven. As the drums thundered through the western gates, Li Guangli's army marched toward the desert. Behind them, the capital glowed with gold and lanterns. Ahead lay the vast emptiness of the Taklamakan, where heat and hunger would test them long before any enemy's blade. What began as a quest for beauty would now become one of the most brutal campaigns in Chinese history, a war not over land or empire, but over a creature that had become the stuff of legend. The Han army departed in spring, when the desert still clung to a fragile coolness. Beneath banners of crimson silk, Li Guangli led his men into the unknown. 20,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and a trail of oxen and carts that vanished into the rising haze. Their destination lay far beyond the horizon. Alexandria Eschate, the gleaming city of the Greeks in Fergana, where the heavenly horses waited. Between them and that promise stretched the most unforgiving landscape on earth. The Taklamakan Desert did not fight with arrows or swords. It fought with thirst. For weeks, the army trudged through dunes that swallowed sound and hope alike. The sun hammered down with merciless precision, bleaching bones before they touched the ground. Windstorms rose without warning, turning day to dusk, scouring the skin from the living and burying the dead in shifting tombs of sand. The oasis towns that dotted the Tarim Basin, small, glittering refuges amid desolation, closed their gates as the Han approached. Li Guangli sent envoys demanding grain, water, and camels, but the Tocharian city-states refused. They had seen foreign armies vanish in the sands before, and they feared provoking Dayuan's wrath. Their rejection turned desperation into rage. The general ordered his men to take what they needed by force. Battles flared across the oases, brief, chaotic clashes that left walls burning and wells poisoned. The cost was devastating. Men died not from enemy blades, but from exhaustion, thirst, and disease. By the time the army emerged from the desert, it was a shadow of what it had been. Thousands of corpses trailed behind them, their bones bleaching in the endless dunes. The survivors staggered into the valleys of Fergana, their armor rusted, their eyes hollow. When they finally beheld the white walls of Alexandria Eschate, hope flickered, then died. The Greeks of Dayuan stood firm upon their ramparts, refusing surrender. For 40 days, Li Guangli tested their defenses. Siege towers collapsed under Greek arrows, rams splintered on stone, and every night the desert winds howled through the camps like mourning spirits. The Chinese had crossed half the world, only to be turned away at its edge. With no supplies and no path home but the desert itself, the general made the hardest decision of his life. He ordered a retreat. What remained of the once mighty expedition limped back east, hounded by hunger and humiliation. The heavenly horses stayed behind, untouched, their hooves drumming softly against the valley floor as the invaders vanished into the dust. When word reached Emperor Wu, his fury burned hotter than the desert sun. The dream of the heavenly horses had nearly destroyed an army, but to the emperor, that only meant the prize was worthy of another try. The next march would be greater, grander, unstoppable. The defeat in the west reached Chang'an like a wound carried by the wind. The court whispered that the gods themselves had abandoned the army. The desert had swallowed men and honor alike. But to Emperor Wu, defeat was not a lesson. It was an insult. The loss of an army could be forgiven, but the loss of imperial dignity could not. He would not be defied by desert or by Greeks. He would bring the heavenly horses to China, even if it meant turning the sands red with blood. In the spring of 102 BCE, the emperor summoned Li Guangli again. Before the gathered court, he gave his general a new command. Not an expedition, but a reckoning. This time, there would be no hesitation, no retreat. Take whatever men you need, the emperor declared. If heaven itself stands between us and those horses, then strike heaven. The words spread through the capital like fire. Soon, recruitment drums thundered in every province, echoing the hunger for redemption. An army 3 times larger than before was raised. 60,000 soldiers, tens of thousands of laborers, and 100,000 oxen to pull the siege engines. Supplies filled the roads westward for months. Every craftsman, every farmer, every soldier became part of the machine that would grind Dayuan into submission. This was no longer about horses. It was about the will of the empire, about proving that the reach of the Han was infinite. When Li Guangli set out once more, even the desert seemed to tremble. This time, the oasis cities did not resist. The news of his coming had preceded him, and their rulers met him on their knees, offering grain, camels, and guides. Yet the desert exacted its price nonetheless. Sandstorms devoured men, frost claimed them by night, and hunger stalked every march. By the time they reached the fertile plains of Fergana, half the army was gone, consumed not by battle, but by the silence of the Taklamakan. Still, what remained was enough to shake the earth. As the soldiers crested the last ridge, they saw once again the white walls of Alexandria Eshate rising in the distance. For the Greeks of Dayuan, it must have felt as though the mountains themselves had come alive. Wave after wave of soldiers in bronze and silk, siege engines creaking under banners painted with dragons. The long road of vengeance had reached its end. The emperor's wrath had crossed the world. The siege that followed would test both sides beyond endurance, but for the Han soldiers who survived the desert, death before failure was the only law left. And for Li Guangli, the only prize worth living for, the only one that could redeem his name, awaited behind those walls, stamping its hooves like thunder, the heavenly horses of Fergana. The second Han invasion fell upon Alexandria Eshate like an approaching storm. From the towers, the defenders saw it first as a shimmering line upon the horizon, then as an ocean of banners, chariots, and men that darkened the plain. Dust rolled ahead of them like a tidal wave. The Greeks of Dayuan had believed no empire could cross the Taklamakan twice. Now they watched as 60,000 Chinese soldiers and their siege engines assembled before their walls, silent and terrible beneath the summer sun. Li Guangli encamped his army in a wide ring around the city, digging trenches and raising wooden towers that faced the gleaming ramparts. The sound of hammering filled the valley as war machines were built, rams capped with bronze heads, scaling ladders, and the fearsome assault carts that the Han had perfected in earlier wars. The general ordered no parley, no message of peace. This was not a campaign of negotiation. It was the settling of an insult. Inside the city, the mood was defiant but uncertain. The Dayuan nobles argued in marble halls that still bore the pillars of Greek design, their voices echoing beneath fading frescoes of Zeus and Athena. They were merchants and scholars, not warriors, yet pride would not allow them to kneel. The city's garrison, a patchwork of Greek descendants and local levies, took up positions on the walls, their bronze helmets glinting like stars against the sunlight. The siege began with thunder. Catapults hurled stones that shattered roofs and temples. The Chinese assault carts rolled forward under curtains of arrows. The defenders answered with firepots, boiling oil, and desperate sorties that burned in the night. For 40 days the battle raged in the heat, a rhythm of drums and screams that blurred into madness. When night fell, neither side slept. Only the wounded moaned beneath the walls, and the jackals came to feed. By the 40th dawn, exhaustion hung over both armies like smoke. Li Guangli gathered his officers and gave a single order: no retreat, no mercy. Siege engines were lashed together into a moving fortress, and the assault began anew. Under a hail of arrows, Han soldiers climbed the ladders in waves, their armor slick with sweat and blood. Battering rams smashed at the gates until the timbers burst apart. When the dust settled, the outer wall of Alexandria Eshate had fallen. Inside the city, panic replaced defiance. The nobles, men of marble palaces and vineyards, looked upon the smoldering ruins and saw the end of their world. They met in secret that night, torches trembling in their hands, and made their choice. Their king, who had sworn never to bow, was struck down by his own council. At dawn, his severed head was carried through the gates on a golden platter. The gates opened, the city surrendered. Li Guangli entered without a word. Behind him marched the banners of Han, their dragons unfurling in the foreign wind. The surviving nobles fell to their knees, offering tribute and the prize the emperor desired above all else: the heavenly horses of Fergana. The war of pride and endurance had ended not with victory or defeat, but with exhaustion and silence. Yet the echoes of this siege would ripple across the centuries, binding two worlds that had once been strangers. When the gates of Alexandria Eshate creaked open to the dawn, the air was heavy with the scent of smoke and surrender. Li Guangli entered the city not as a conqueror drunk on glory, but as a man hollowed out by survival. Behind him trailed soldiers whose armor was cracked, whose faces were ghostly with dust and exhaustion. The siege had consumed 40 days and half his army, but at last, the heavenly horses now belonged to the Son of Heaven. The streets of Dayuan were eerily silent. The marble facades that once glistened in sunlight now stood scorched and broken, frescoes of Greek gods blackened by fire. The bodies of soldiers, Greek and Chinese alike, lay tangled beneath the walls, the price of two civilizations colliding. Li Guangli ordered no looting, no vengeance. Instead, he walked to the central square, where trembling nobles awaited their fate. They laid before him gold, wine, and scrolls written in a language he could not read, symbols of a world that had just ended. Among the offerings were the heavenly horses. Hundreds of them, their coats glistening like bronze, their nostrils flaring as if they too understood the cost of victory. The general approached the herd in silence. When one reared up, stamping at the ground, Li Guangli smiled faintly. "You will run for heaven now," he whispered. These were not trophies of war. They were living proof that the emperor's reach had pierced the edge of the world. A new ruler was appointed, a puppet king, chosen from among the nobles willing to serve Han authority. He swore allegiance to the empire and promised to send tribute each year: horses, wine, and men to guard the western roads. It was the beginning of a fragile peace. The banners of the dragon rose over the city's citadel, and the wind that once carried Greek hymns now carried the sound of Chinese drums. That night, Li Guangli's camp was quiet. The soldiers, too weary to celebrate, sat among their fallen comrades. Some stared westward, toward lands they would never see again, others eastward, toward home. In his tent, the general wrote his report, a document that would travel back across deserts and mountains to the emperor's throne. Its message was simple: the horses of heaven are ours. When the Han army departed, Alexandria Eshate remained, battered but alive. Yet the Greeks who stayed behind would never be the same. Their independence was gone, their language fading, their gods silent. But their blood, their art, and their legacy would flow eastward with the horses, carried by traders and monks long after their names were forgotten. The fall of Dayuan was not an ending, but a crossing, the moment when the last breath of Alexander's dream met the first whisper of the Silk Road. The return march of Li Guangli's army was a procession of ghosts. They carried the spoils of victory, 3,000 of the heavenly horses, their coats glimmering under the desert sun. But behind them lay the graves of tens of thousands. The Taklamakan, which had devoured their comrades on the way out, now awaited them again. Yet this time, the road no longer belonged to the desert. It belonged to China. The oasis kingdoms that had once defied the Han now opened their gates in awe. Messengers galloped ahead proclaiming the fall of Dayuan, and one by one, the city-states of the Tarim Basin bent the knee. From Kucha to Lulan, from Turpan to Hotan, their rulers emerged bearing gifts of jade, silk, and grain, pleading to become allies rather than enemies. The sound of submission echoed through the valleys, not through battle, but through fear. For the West had seen what the East could do. Li Guangli established garrisons in each oasis, small clusters of Chinese soldiers who built watchtowers, dug wells, and marked the first permanent imperial presence beyond the frontier. Outposts grew like seeds in sand. The road linking them became a lifeline of trade and tribute, patrolled by caravans of camels and guarded by men who had seen the edge of the world. From these routes would grow something greater than empire, a web of connection that would one day span continents. When the general finally crossed back into Han territory, banners tattered, his arrival was greeted with reverence and disbelief. Emperor Wu received him in the grand hall of Chang'an, where the air smelled of incense and lacquer. Before the throne stood the horses, massive, radiant, divine. They snorted, pawed at the floor, their eyes reflecting the torchlight like molten gold. The emperor rose, awe softening even his iron will. "These," he said quietly, "are heaven's gift to the Middle Kingdom." In the years that followed, the protectorate of the western regions was established. The deserts that had once separated worlds now became bridges between them. Silk flowed west, gold and glass flowed east. And though the men who had fought and died in Fergana would fade from memory, their footprints remained, pressed into the sand of a road that would soon carry merchants, monks, and the stories of empires. The war for the heavenly horses had begun as vengeance and ended as vision. It opened a path where none had existed, stitching together the destinies of Greece and China. Two civilizations that were never meant to meet, yet whose echoes would now travel the same wind. The war of the heavenly horses had ended, but its echoes did not fade. They spread, carried by the traders and soldiers who followed in its wake. Across the newly conquered oases, silk began to flow westward for the first time, exchanged for glass, gold, and the strange blue pigment of lapis lazuli. In the markets of Bactria and Parthia, merchants now spoke of a distant empire called Han, a land of dragons and scholars, of paper and bronze. China, once sealed behind mountains, had begun to whisper into the world. In the shattered cities of the Greeks, change came quietly. The temples of marble still stood, but the voices inside now prayed in many tongues. Their children no longer remembered the sea, and the myths of Olympus faded into memory. Yet Greek culture did not die. It transformed. In the kingdoms farther south, where the descendants of Alexander's soldiers had settled in Bactria and India, the Greeks encountered a new faith rising from the plains, Buddhism. And in this meeting, a new chapter of humanity began. Artists who once sculpted Zeus and Apollo now turned their chisels toward a new figure, the Buddha. From their hands came the first human depictions of the Enlightened One, serene, graceful, draped in robes carved with Hellenic folds. The Greek devotion to form and proportion gave the spiritual face of Asia its first human likeness. The calm smile of Gandhara's Buddhas was born from the marriage of two worlds, one of reason and geometry, the other of compassion and transcendence. Meanwhile, in China, the heavenly horses became symbols of cosmic power. Emperor Wu ordered them immortalized in bronze and jade, their muscular forms galloping through palace corridors and tomb walls. Centuries later, in the Tang dynasty, artists would still depict them as divine creatures, the steeds that carried emperors between heaven and earth. In the rustle of silk and the gleam of ink, the memory of Dayuan endured, transformed from a tale of blood and conquest into one of wonder and connection. Thus, the war that began over horses had become something far greater, a meeting of spirits. The Greeks had left their art and philosophy in Asia. The Chinese had carried back the idea that the world was vast, diverse, and alive with other civilizations. What was once conquest had turned into exchange. What was once distance had become dialogue. The steppe winds that once carried war now carried caravans, their bells ringing softly through the deserts where men had once died of thirst. Between east and west, a bridge had been built, not of stone or empire, but of ideas, faith, and the unending human hunger to reach beyond the horizon. Centuries later, when scholars traced the origins of the Silk Road, they found its roots buried not in peace, but in war, in the blood and dust of the campaign for the heavenly horses. What began as a clash of pride and ambition between two distant peoples became the first thread that stitched the world together. Through the valleys of Fergana and the oases of the Tarim Basin, a network of roads emerged, carrying merchants, monks, and memories between the ends of the earth. The Greeks of Central Asia would vanish from history, their marble temples collapsing into dust, their language fading from the tongues of men. Yet their influence lived on in subtle ways, in the curves of Buddhist sculpture, in the philosophy that shaped Mahayana, in the notion that wisdom could travel farther than armies. And in the East, the Han Empire, though it too would rise and fall, left behind something eternal, the belief that knowledge was a form of conquest greater than war. The heavenly horses themselves became myth. Poets of the Tang dynasty would later sing of them as celestial beings who galloped among the stars, symbols of imperial destiny and divine favor. Their images adorned tombs, tapestries, and temples, reminders that even the mightiest emperors once waged war for beauty. They were not merely animals, but emblems of the unbreakable human desire to reach what lies beyond sight. In the quiet centuries that followed, the road carved by Li Guangli's soldiers became the lifeline of civilizations. Silk from China reached Roman hands. Glass from Syria sparkled in Chang'an. Religions crossed deserts, art crossed mountains, and ideas crossed boundaries no army could hold. The East and West, once strangers divided by the world's width, began to see themselves reflected in one another. And somewhere, perhaps, the ghosts of Alexander's settlers and the soldiers of Han still ride together across the endless steppe, not as enemies, but as witnesses to the day two worlds met. The war for the heavenly horses was not merely a battle for beasts of legend. It was the dawn of connection, the moment when history itself decided to become global. The wind that once carried Zhang Qian's lonely footsteps now carries the echoes of countless travelers, monks, merchants, dreamers, all walking the same path he first opened. His journey, born of failure, became the spark of something immortal. For in the end, it was not conquest or empire that endured, but the bridge built between them, a bridge made of courage, curiosity, and the endless longing of humanity to know the world beyond its own horizon.